You're listening to BQN. Assimilate the audio.
Good morning, I'm Chrissie De Clerck-Szilagyi.
And I'm Jason Szilagyis with today's Caffeinated History with the Szilagyis on the BQN Podcast Collective.
Before we jump into our topic for the day, we'd like to take a moment to thank our BQN Patreon patrons who make this show possible. Listeners, you can hear your name listed here as one of our associate producers with your monthly subscription of just $10 at patreon.com/BQN. Today's topic is the Nazi rally at Madison Square Garden on the 20th of February in 1939. In the years before World War II, anti-Nazi and anti-fascist sentiment was not universal in the United States. Bigotry in many forms had been part of American society from its beginnings, and anti-Semitism in particular saw an increase during the years of the Great Depression due to the very old stereotype of Jews running banks and having control over the financial system. Similar beliefs and a much longer history of such ideas led to the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany during this interwar period. While anti-Semitism has always existed in the United States, it has never been the most prominent form of bigotry, overshadowed as it was by the racism that was required to maintain the slave system and the subsequent systemic racism. The blame for the Depression was also applied differently in the U.S. than in Germany. Americans have a tendency to blame the president for things that go bad and credit them for things that go well. So while Germany blamed the Jews, amongst others, Americans blame President Herbert Hoover and his administration. Hoover's successor, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, enacted his New Deal programs beginning in 1933. They involved heavy government support for the unemployed, protections for workers, and many public works progress, amongst other changes. His policies were called socialist and communist by conservatives in the United States, which created a connection between the ideas they opposed and the ones opposed by right-wing governments in Europe, including the Nazis. They found it easy to draw lines between FDR and the collapsed Weimar government of Germany and the Soviet Union. The American Nazi Party, officially the German-American Bund, was created in 1933, originally under the name Friends of the New Germany, by Hans Spank Nobel under the instruction of Rudolf Hess. They presented themselves as patriots and connected Nazi ideologies with what were deemed traditional American values. In keeping with these, they did not hide their white supremacist agenda. Spank Nobel did not lead the party for very long. He was deported in October of that same year for being an unregistered foreign agent. The organization remained small for the next few years and was reorganized as the German-American Bund in 1936 in order to seem less foreign. By 1938, this rebranded Bund had become a political force. Its leader, Fritz Kuhn, was one of the most prominent right-wing voices in the United States, often called the American Hitler. On the 20th of February in 1939, Kuhn took the stage at Madison Square Garden to address a crowd of 22,000 people. He was flanked by banners with American flags and swastikas, and ones that said things like "Smash Jewish Communism." And behind him was an immense portrait of George Washington, whom Kuhn called the first fascist. The rally was immediately met with opposition and calls for it to be stopped and the Bund's activities banned. However, it was allowed to happen under the auspices of the First Amendment. As New York Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia said, to allow it was, quote, a contrast between the way we do things here and the way they do things there. And so, as these American Nazis made their way to Madison Square that evening, they were protected from protesters by the police, and there were tens of thousands of protesters. Among them were a group of Jewish veterans of World War I who marched on the street carrying American flags, and the orchestra from a nearby theater brought out their instruments to play the Star-Spangled Banner for the crowd. Members of the local socialist and communist groups also chanted anti-fascist slogans. Only one protester, Isidor Greenbaum, made himself known inside when he ran onto the stage shouting "Down with Hitler." He was attacked by the people on stage and taken out by police. Greenbaum later explained that he had gone to the rally to see how bad the message was and was overcome as, quote, they talk so much against my religion and there was so much persecution, I lost my head and felt it was my duty to talk. He was fined $25 for disturbing the peace. It was not long before Greenbaum was able to act on his words by joining the Navy after the U.S. entered the war. The rally itself was carefully choreographed and contained all of the elements one would expect: blaming Jewish cabals for the world's problems, condemnation of FDR and his New Deal programs, and the calls for a United States run by whites. But whatever the Bund had hoped to achieve with the rally, it didn't. This was the last major event conducted by the group. At the time, they were already being investigated for financial fraud, a crime which sent Kuhn to prison in December of 1939. By that time, though, the Bund had already begun losing members since the German invasion of Poland, which began World War II. Kunz's successor as party leader, Gerhard Kunz, was convicted of espionage and jailed in November of 1941. The few people who were still members a month later, in December of 1941, quickly found it hard to justify their association with an organization that supported a regime against whom the United States had just declared war. The last leader of the German-American Bund, George Frobrize, committed suicide in 1942 after having been subpoenaed to appear in front of a grand jury to deal with charges of having encouraged members of the Bund to evade the draft. Looking back at the Second World War, it is easy to think of Americans as having always been on the correct side, but the reality is not so clear-cut. Racism and anti-Semitism have been part of American society from the beginning, and these have been and are being used by demagogues to mask their own desire for power behind supposed populism. The only way to assure that racism and anti-Semitism are not also present for the end of American society is to remain vigilant in keeping such people away from power. Thank you for listening. We'd also like to thank our History with the Szilagys Patreon patrons, Pati, Laura Dull, Kris Hill, and Susan Capuzzi-De Clerck. Their contributions help us to have the time to research and write what you're hearing. And you can help us just like they do with a monthly subscription at patreon.com/historywiththeszilagys. Also, thank you to Mark White for the awesome show art and Zach Tripp for the wonderful closing music. Please subscribe in your favorite podcast player and don't forget to rate and review us there as well. And while you're at it, check out the rest of the great shows on the BQN Collective. We'd love to hear what you think. If you'd like to reach out, you can find our network on the website formerly known as Twitter and Blue Sky at BQN Podcasts, and this podcast in particular at History Szilagyi. You can also talk about any and all of the BQN podcasts in our Facebook group, the BQN Collective. And last but not least, you can find me also on Blue Sky and that website formerly known as Twitter at The Goddess Livia. That's TheGoddessLivia.
And me at Jason Dark Elf. We'd love to hear topic suggestions. What would you like to ask on Caffeinated History?